Howard, and welcome to Spiritual Shorts, 5 to 10 minute videos on faith and life from a uniquely Swedenborgian perspective. How are you? I'm serious. 4 to 8 weeks into this lockdown or self-isolation, how are you doing? How are you getting on? I'll admit that I'm not always doing that great. And not really for the reasons that you would think. I don't feel isolated necessarily. I'm surrounded by family in my house. My office or my church is right next door to my house. And in some respects, I'm able to maintain the same routine that I kept before the lockdown. But I also find myself feeling very alone. Even surrounded with family, I feel alone in my thoughts. Reflecting on that earlier this week, the idea came to mind that our thoughts become our reality. I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. You've probably maybe even experienced it. But our thoughts become our reality. That reminded me of a story from about 20 years ago that I thought I would share with you. But before I get into the story, I want to share with you a few useful, maybe even essential teachings of the new church. This is, after all, a talk from a uniquely Swedenborgian perspective. The first thing I want to mention is that all people who live a good life, guided by their faith, will have a place in heaven. I mention that for two reasons. One, it's a beautiful, beautiful teaching. But the other reason I mention it is that the story that I'm about to tell identifies an individual, and specifically as to their faith. I don't want anybody to think that I am in any way, shape, or form condemning that individual, because ultimately it comes down to, does one live their faith into their life for the good? The second one I'll mention is that new church people or Swedenborgians subscribe to the belief that the second coming is not an event that's going to happen literally at some point in the future where we'll see massive changes in the world, but that it was a spiritual event that happened over 200 years ago, and that that same spiritual event continues to happen inside each of us, regardless of faith, as we seek to live God's will into our lives. The third teaching that I will mention is that heaven and hell are not reward and punishment. Heaven and hell are choices that we make based on how we have lived our lives in this world, based on what we have come to love in this world. In other words, our thoughts will become our reality. The story I wanted to share. Attending a bar mitzvah 20 years ago, I got into a conversation about faith with the rabbi. This was well before I ever considered entering ministry. But it was an interesting conversation. The rabbi was unfamiliar with the new church, unfamiliar with the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, and asked me what was unique about our faith. I answered that Swedenborgians or new church people believe that the second coming as prophesied in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, is not a literal event that'll happen at some point in the future, but that it's a spiritual event that happened during the 18th century, and it continues to happen for each person who is seeking to change their lives for the good, guided by their faith. I went on to say that I look at all the progress society has made over the last 250 years. Almost a universal acknowledgement of basic human rights afforded to everyone in the world, or at least that they should be afforded to everyone in the world. And the incredible advances in sciences and medicine that have transformed our lives in ways that were unimaginable. The rabbi looked at me very intently, and they said, "So if I understand correctly, you look at all the good that's in the world, and you think the second coming has already occurred." That's very interesting because as a Jew, I look at all the bad that's in the world, and I think that first coming could never have happened. Thoughts really do become your reality. Bringing that story and the idea of thoughts becoming our reality together into the future has me reflecting on what comes next. Very soon, at least in my community, we're going to start that slow, hopefully steady return to normal. And I'm focused on what that new normal is going to be like for me. I'm not talking about, am I going to wear a mask, or are people going to come back to church, or what's my son's school going to be like? I'm thinking more along the lines of what is that going to be for me in my head, or what's that going to be like for me spiritually? For example, am I going to be able to look at other people without being suspicious? Are they sick? Did they properly wash their hands? Or am I going to pine for the familiarity of my hometown and disconnect from where I live and the community I serve now? Or will I react at some point in the future, overreact at some point in the future, when I feel that somebody is impinging on my freedom of movement? How will the thoughts I find myself living with now in this isolation affect me and my future after this isolation? I, for one, am going to spend the next couple of weeks cataloging those thoughts. I invite you to join me in cataloging your own thoughts. What thoughts have taken up residence in your head during the lockdown? What thoughts am I going to leave here in lockdown? And what thoughts am I going to take with me into the new normal? What thoughts are going to become my reality? Hey, thank you for joining me for Spiritual Shorts, and God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Spiritual Shorts, 5 to 10 minute videos on faith and life from a uniquely Swedenborgian perspective. And if you did, please press the like button. If you'd like to see future episodes, you can subscribe by clicking the subscribe button.